Have you ever thought about a second marriage? Was there a moment when you sat alone, wondering if you had the courage to step into a new marriage? And then, right after, all the memories of the first one came rushing back: the divorce court, the assets split in half, the once warm house now belonging to someone else, the weekends divided with your children, and the emptiness of realizing the trust you once gave was no longer whole. Those memories make you sigh, asking yourself if it's worth trying again. You remember the feeling of loss after the first time, the long nights questioning whose fault it was. Maybe you also felt that you never wanted to put your heart on the line again. If you see yourself in these feelings, you are not alone. Millions of men out there, at the same age as you, are sitting with the same question: to continue or to stop. And that is exactly what we're going to talk about today. Why do so many men choose not to remarry? Is it because of the fear of loss? Or because they have found a quieter life on their own? And most importantly, is this truly the right decision for the rest of their lives? The cost of a first marriage often doesn't end with the divorce papers. For many men, it's a total shock. First, financially. Years of work, saving every dollar to buy a home, to build a retirement fund, to prepare for old age. And yet, within just a few months, those assets are cut in half by a court ruling. Beyond losing part of their property, many also have to pay divorce fees, attorney fees, and in many cases, monthly support for an ex-wife or children. It's not just numbers on paper, it's overtime hours, rewritten retirement plans, and sometimes the exhaustion of watching a bank balance shrink day after day. But money is only one part. The emotional cost is even heavier. A man who once believed family was the safest place now faces its collapse. They feel the loss not just because the relationship ended, but because everything built together has fallen apart. The sense of failure follows them through lonely dinners, through mornings waking up in an empty house. Many have to relearn how to live alone, how to arrange time with their children, how to grow used to silence where there was once the laughter of family. There is also a social cost. Relatives may say nothing, but their eyes are enough to stir guilt. Friends may offer comfort, but they still have families to go home to while you don't. Sometimes a man has to hear whispers behind his back. What did he do to make the marriage fall apart? All of it makes him feel judged, whether right or wrong. Picture the story of a man walking out of court with divorce papers in his hand. The house that once held his family now belongs to his ex-wife. Most of his retirement fund has been withdrawn to be split in half. He has to move into a small apartment, starting again from almost nothing. Every morning, he brews coffee in an empty kitchen, reminding himself to keep working to pay fees and rebuild a future. That feeling doesn't fade in a month or two, it can follow him for years. With such an experience, it's no surprise that many say, once is enough. After going through a failed marriage, fear becomes a quiet part of many men's thoughts. They don't just fear love, they fear everything that could drag them back into the same old mistakes. The first and clearest fear is the fear of losing assets again. Having once seen a house sold, a retirement fund drained, and bank accounts split in half, a man looks at marriage with a far more practical eye. He reminds himself that just one wrong decision could turn years of work into nothing. And that worry weighs heavily on every new relationship, even when real feelings are present. But it's not just about money. Many fear repeating old conflicts, fear arguing over the same issues as before. They've heard the words that cut deep, sat in silence through tense dinners, stayed up nights trying to save a marriage, only to realize every effort was useless. The thought of going back into that cycle makes them hesitant, even if their current partner is nothing like the one before. They carry memories like scars, and those scars make them cautious about any long-term commitment. There is another fear, rarely mentioned but very real, the fear of not having the strength to start over. When young, one failure can be seen as a lesson, with time to rebuild. But after 50, health, energy, and time are no longer abundant. The thought of beginning a new marriage, getting to know a new family, adjusting to the habits and lifestyle of another person, makes many feel overwhelmed before they even begin. Another part of the worry is the fear of being used. When a man has reached a certain standing in his career and built a stable life, it's hard to avoid suspicion. Is someone coming to him for love or for financial reasons. Stories of being taken advantage of, manipulated, or controlled by interests only make him more guarded. He doesn't want to become the one paying for his own loneliness. First, data from sociological studies in the US reflect this as well. The remarriage rate of men over 50 has dropped significantly over the past 20 years. This doesn't mean they don't need love, it shows they are more cautious about binding themselves legally again. They seek relationships that are comfortable, less restrictive, but they stay away from marriage papers. These fears combined lead many to choose solitude, seeing it as the safer option. But not everyone stops at fear. Some still decide to remarry and end up paying a different price. There are men who, after stepping out of their first marriage, feel such emptiness that they can't bear it. They fear the silence in the house, fear meals for one, fear looking into the future without seeing anyone beside them. And it's that fear of loneliness that makes them enter a second marriage too quickly. Mark, 54, is a typical example. Just 6 months after his divorce, he met a woman on a dating app and believed this was his chance to start life over. They married in a rush. But less than 2 years later, they faced the same old arguments, differences about money, about raising children, about daily habits they couldn't reconcile. In the end, the second marriage also fell apart, leaving Mark with a new wound, deeper than the first, because this time he knew clearly that he had rushed. The second story is a lesson in poor preparation. Daniel, 60, had built a small company after many years of hard work. When he met his new partner, he felt it was a chance to live happily in his later years. But he skipped an important step, signing a prenuptial agreement. When the marriage broke down, the divorce split off part of his company, throwing his finances into crisis. It took him years to restore his business, and he always told himself that if only he had slowed down and prepared more carefully before marrying a second time. There are relationships full of affection that still cannot last. Thomas, 62, remarried a gentle woman who cared for him deeply. They truly loved each other, but conflict arose when his son strongly opposed and refused to accept a stepmother. The family atmosphere grew more tense, and in the end, Thomas himself chose to end the marriage to preserve his bond with his son. This love didn't fail because of betrayal or money, it failed because the gap between two generations could not be bridged. These stories share one thing: loneliness makes men prone to quick decisions. They don't want to prolong the emptiness, so they try to fill the void as soon as possible. But rushed love doesn't allow enough time for hidden differences to surface. When the initial excitement fades, the old problems reappear, sometimes even heavier. And a second breakup often leaves a scar that's harder to heal, because it carries the weight of disappointment in oneself. So is there a way to love, to truly have a life partner, without paying as high a price as the last time? After going through a failed marriage, the most important thing is not to immediately find someone new to fill the void, but to heal and rebuild yourself. Give yourself time to process lingering emotions, acknowledge the pain, and learn to let go of anger. If needed, seek a therapist or support groups for people who have been divorced. This not only brings relief, but also helps you understand more clearly what you truly need in a new relationship. When you enter love with a calm mind, you see things more clearly and are less likely to repeat old mistakes. When you're ready to date again, do it with clarity. Don't rush into a relationship just because of loneliness. Observe how the other person behaves in different situations, when they're happy, when they're angry, when they're disappointed. Words can be sweet, but actions reflect true character. Give both of you time to understand each other before making a long-term commitment. A relationship built slowly is often more lasting than one that begins in haste. Finances are one of the most painful consequences after divorce, so setting boundaries from the start is something that cannot be overlooked. Keep assets separate, have open conversations about money, and consider signing a prenuptial agreement if marriage is the decision. This is not about a lack of trust, but about protecting both sides from potential disputes in the future. A clear agreement helps both feel secure and allows focus on building happiness instead of worrying about risks. Remember that the label of marriage is not as important as the quality of the relationship. There are couples who never register for marriage but live happily together for years because they share values, respect personal freedom, and maintain open communication. If you feel that a stable relationship without papers is enough for both, that is also a reasonable choice. What matters is that you feel at peace and free to be yourself. For example, there are couples in their 60 seconds who choose to live together, share living expenses, and take care of each other without marrying. They feel this reduces legal and financial pressure while still giving them the companionship and warmth they long for. It's proof that happiness doesn't necessarily require a ceremony or a certificate. Therefore, a second marriage is not a nightmare if you enter it with preparation. When you know clearly what you want, are ready to protect your own boundaries, and choose the right person, you can absolutely have a deep, mature, and meaningful relationship. Late love does not mean love is any less valuable. After 50, the heart no longer races like it did at 20, but the feelings are deeper and more mature. This is no longer love to prove something to the world, but love to warm the rest of life. It is not loud, not restless, but it carries a quiet strength that makes people feel at peace and free to be themselves. Mr. Jack is living proof. After his wife passed away, he thought he would live alone for the rest of his life. He no longer believed he could find someone who truly understood him at 67. But one morning, in a photography class for seniors, he met Mrs. Ann. They began with short conversations about photo techniques, about past trips. Then, those conversations grew longer, deeper, and gradually became an essential part of daily life. Jack said he didn't feel swept off his feet right away. Instead, he felt a sense of ease when he was with Anne. No pressure, no big expectations, just two people doing small things together, walking in the park, photographing sunsets, cooking simple dinners. A year later, they decided to remarry. No grand wedding, no dazzling promises, just two people holding hands in front of close friends, happy to have found a late soulmate. Jack's story shows that what matters is not whether you marry, but whether you find someone truly right. Someone who makes you want to share both sad and happy days, someone you can sit in silence with and not feel lonely. At this age, love is no longer a race but a slow journey, where two people watch the scenery together, talk together, and grow old together in peace. And if you are still searching, don't rush, but don't close your heart. If you have ever been through a marriage, a divorce, or even a remarriage, please share your story in the comments. Maybe your experience will help someone else avoid unnecessary pain. If you find this content relatable and want to continue the journey with us, hit subscribe to watch more in-depth videos about psychology and the journey of men in midlife. Thank you for listening until the end, and see you in the next video with real and inspiring stories.